In this video, I'll be building the 120mm guns. There are only 4 of them, and they only consist of 2 plastic pieces, the gun and its mount, and a shield. And I'll not be using the shield because there is a replacement for it in the Photo-etch kit. The Photo-etch for these guns consists of 2 pieces that make up the shield, and a handful of pieces that go on the gun and its mount. The first thing I noticed about the 120mm guns is that Trumpeter did make an attempt to put some detail into the molding. If you look very carefully, you can see a little wheel for rotating the gun, but being molded in plastic, it's quite difficult to see and the detail isn't that great. But the point is that there is some detail there, and that will create a raised surface, which will make it a bit more difficult for the Photo-etch to stick to it. So it needs to be filed off into a smooth finish for the Photo-etch. My thinking was, because these parts are quite small, it would probably be easier to sand them on the sprue. The sprue makes it much easier to hold the part. Obviously I can hold the entire sprue instead of trying to grip the little gun. And at this point there aren't many other parts on the sprue that I need to work around, so I'm not too concerned about damaging other parts. The trick is to sand it just enough such that the detail comes off, but to not damage any of the other details surrounding the part, like the platform that it's sitting on. After removing the details of the files, I then clean it up with some fine sandpaper sponge. This just gets a few of the rough edges off and helps you see that you did get off all the detail quite nicely. And if there are deeper scratches, it'll help remove them so they don't show through after the part has been painted. There are also a few molding lines that needed to be removed, especially on the back of the breech. There's also a small piece of Photo-etch that's going to go on there, so it's important that that part be flat as well. So that was just a quick lap with the fine file. I then also decided that it would probably be easier to attach the Photo-etch while it is on the sprue. If I were to do this again, I would make one change and I'd cut the piece of sprue that is attached to the top of the gun. That got in the way and was a bit of a pain to remove. I would cut that off and sand that. There's no reason for it to be attached from 2 angles at this stage. The majority of the force that is put on this part is during the sanding to remove the detail. To glue down these parts, I place them on the smooth flat surface, dry, and then hold them down with some tweezers, and then take extra thin super glue and apply it to the edges. The glue will be drawn underneath the part and tack it in place. I do then put on multiple layers in addition to this, and the reason for that is not to hold the part on better. A very little bit of glue will stick the piece of Photo-etch to the part. The reason for that is I want to try and fill the seams between the Photo-etch and the plastic so that it has a smooth appearance. So what I'm doing is I'm just building up layer upon layer of glue on top of glue to smooth it in. There will still be a step, but what I don't want is it to look like it steps in and then there's this crevasse between the Photo-etch and the plastic. I want it to be a smooth plate that looks like it's been welded onto the side of the gun, basically. You'll see me doing a lot more of that, putting down layers of extra thin super glue when it comes to the top of the part, because that is going to be an area where you will be able to view it, especially with these guns with the breech exposed outside of the gun shield. And from the viewer's perspective looking down, it would look strange to see Photo-etch panels that are peeling off on the side of the gun. You want it to look like a single piece of machinery. I do prefer this method compared to placing a blob of Photo-etch on the part first. I find if you place, for example, extra thick super glue on the part, it's very easy to put too much on, then it squeezes out the sides, and if you don't position it in the piece of Photo-etch perfectly first time round, it's very often not correctly orientated. So for something like this, being able to place it first with no glue, move it as much as you like, and then just hold it in place and get that first a little drop of super glue on it to hold it in place, and then you can work around it with as much super glue as you like to get the proper effect, is just so much easier in the long run. For smaller pieces like this, which are just circles that go onto a circle on the breech of the gun, there it makes sense to just use extra thick super glue. To hold a piece this small on such a small place is going to be incredibly difficult. In this scenario, I then put down a very small drop of extra thick super glue and then place the piece of Photo-etch on top of it If you feel that you didn't put enough of the thick super glue down, you can always reinforce it with some extra thin super glue later. I only felt the need to do it on the first piece of Photo-etch over here. The rest I was happy with the way they got stuck down. I'm just working my way around the gun, and now I'm going to flip it over and go onto the other side and put on yet another panel of Photo-etch. This follows the exact same procedure as with the other side of the gun. There's just a little bit less detail on this part. It doesn't have a wheel on it, but exactly the same procedure. Position it dry and then get the extra thin super glue to fill the gap. So now you can see the problem that I had. After I'd stuck all the Photo-etch on, I then thought about it a bit more and realized that I needed to cut these things out. I cut them off a bit low so that I had a part to grip for the next part of the build. But at the top, there's no need for me to grip it there anymore. And all that I've managed to achieve at this point is to have a piece of plastic that needs to be sanded down and made to look good in amongst a section of rather delicate Photo-etch. Even though that Photo-etch is a bit recessed and lower than the actual point that I need to sand, it still is something that needs to be handled, and if you knock that with a file or sandpaper, you can quite easily pull the Photo-etch off. So if I were to do this again, I'd essentially cut the bridge to the top of the gun off, so that what I'm doing now doesn't have to be repeated. Anyways, I came in then and cleaned up the top with my clippers, cutting it down as low as I can without creating a divot in the plastic. Always be a bit more conservative. If you need to come back and cut it again, you can always do that. But if you create a hole, well, then it's a whole procedure with putty and everything to fill it up again, and well, that's just more work. Once cut to a safely short level, I then pulled out my trusty fine file and worked it a bit more to get it level. As you can see, it's very close to the top of the Photo-etch, but unfortunately the photo is lower than the top of the plastic part. It's just a matter of slowly working it down until you get a good blend. I moved over to a round file because I didn't want to accidentally file the groove into the top of the gun, and that can happen with a sharp edge on that rectangular file. There's less chance of that happening with a circular file because obviously it's a circle and there isn't a sharp edge on it apart from the very point. After giving a good inspection, I'm quite happy with that. So this process seems workable. It just needs to be repeated a number of times. Once again, I start with a flat file to get the majority of the remaining plastic off, and then I switch to the round file to do more fine work. Anyways, after filing on the joints, I then once again got out the sanding sponge and just polished off and finished this part of these guns. Even though this wasn't the optimal way to construct them, in the end it worked out and the finish looks good. These parts also have a little ring that sits underneath the base of the gun, showing some little rivets. This is where it would be attached to the deck. It's a nice little bit of detail, though I do suspect it's going to be very hard to see on the model. Anyways, they provide the part, so I will use it. This then necessitated that I cut off this last little piece of sprue, trying to make the cut quite close to the part but leave a little bit of a stub so that I can use it to center this little disc and then also use it as a guide for installing it on the model. These parts with a little plastic cylinder in the middle does mean that it's a lot easier to position the Photo-etch and also gives you a convenient place to apply the super glue. Here I suppose you could use thick super glue pre-applied to the part, but I just prefer to use the extra thin super glue, and it's really not difficult to do. It means that you are going to have less chance of excess glue flowing all over the place and squashing out of the sides, because only the glue that's required will get drawn into the gap, and it'll flow to exactly where it needs to be to make a good bond. If you're finding yourself making a huge mess with super glue, it means you're using too much. After preparing the guns themselves, I then worked on the shields. These shields look so much better than the plastic pieces that come with the kit. The plastic pieces that come in the kit have very thick walls, they look out of scale, they are not nice. The problem with photo etch parts like this is that you have to put a curve on them, and putting a curve on a piece like this can be quite difficult because it has to match the diameter of both the bottom plate and the top plate, with the difficulty of the top plate being at an angle. This is back and forth work, just molding it on a roughly correctly sized cylinder. While I do like the effect that these photo etch shields have, I do not like working with them. Another thing that I should have done before I started this work is to remove the paint. I should have given these parts an acetone bath. The glue is going to stick to the paint instead of to the metal, and then there's a greater chance that the glue pulls off the paint and it becomes unbonded. If the glue is stuck directly to the metal, there's less chance of it accidentally becoming unbonded. It will create a stronger structure. There's also not much point in pre-painting a part like this because of the extensive handling that you're going to put it through. Obviously, rolling cylinders against it and bending it, and in some cases using tweezers to bend it even further, is going to cause scrapes and scratches on the photo etch. So one cannot reasonably expect the paint to survive intact. And if you put a scratch on paint, then you can't just paint over it because then the scratch will show through. So you'll need to clean up the part anyway. So yeah, it's something that I should have done. I'll have to do it in the end anyway, but in the gluing stage, if I had removed this, it would have made things possibly a little bit more easier. It wouldn't have come apart as easily, and I wouldn't have had to reinforce the glue seams as much as I did in the end. After working the shield into the correct shape, I then applied thin super glue from the inside to glue it in place. Even once this glue is stuck down, there's still a fair bit of manhandling required to get it into the correct shape. I find this part rather frustrating. As I say, a curve on a piece like this without proper tabs to glue things down is quite difficult. They provide a little tab for the top of the shield, which is its own piece, but they only provide one. I think they could have put a few more of those on the top, and they could have put some little ears sticking out, or tabs sticking out at the bottom that you could curve around and use to make a bond. I think that would have been a little bit of an improvement over this, but I can make it work. Since the glue is going in a fairly concealed part of the shield, you can put in as much as you like. All you're going to do is smooth out that joint basically. It won't look like a sharp angle, but if a person's really going to look in there and see that, well, good on them. And even still, they might not even be able to realize that there's a buildup of glue in there. So I'm quite happy to be liberal with this, especially with parts like this, which are quite easy to have come apart, especially while you're building them and handling them like this. You can see that as I work these parts with the tweezers, the paint gets scuffed up, and illustrating yet again why there is no point in painting them this early. Now to install the top of these shields, this comes as a separate piece, which now needs to sit on top of that structure, or at least the sides of the structure that have been folded. The expectation that you folded the sides of that shield to perfectly correspond to this section for the top would be unrealistic. The reality is that there will be more handling to get the top to fit on nicely. It was at this point that I realized that the little tab sticking out near that notch was to assist with gluing down the roof, but that it needed to be bent at a better angle, otherwise it was going to create a gap. The trick with these parts is to not have a gap, so you have to get that curve correct so that the curve on the part becomes a straight line for you to put the top on, and then everything needs to be aligned and glued down properly so that you don't have a gap. Otherwise it will look very strange when you're viewing it from the side. You want it to look like a single piece instead of two pieces haphazardly glued together. That's the difficulty with this part. It's the curve. I've said it so many times, but I don't like putting a curve on a part like this without any guidelines to work from, really, because it's just so difficult to get everything lined up properly so that it looks good once it's all glued together. There are just so many things that can go wrong. I did do a bit of reading up on these guns, and I find them to be quite strange. I don't really understand why it is that the Italian designers put them on the ship. They're all 120mm gun, which is nominally a tertiary battery, And the only thing I could find out about them, at least for their purpose, on the Littorio class battleships, is that they were used to fire star shells for illuminating night battles. That doesn't quite make sense to me. Why would you need an entire armament, 4 guns on their mounts with shields and all the associated machinery, just to fire illumination shells? Why can't they use the 90mm heavy AA guns to fire an illumination shell every now and then, or even the 152mm secondary guns? Or maybe they can't elevate high enough to fire a illumination shell, but at least one of the 90mm guns should have been able to do that, surely. And it's not like those 120mm guns would make good secondary armaments. I mean, especially compared to the 152mm guns that they have installed. And it's a 120mm older gun with a short barrel. You can see how after all the handling, these parts have been scuffed up. So now I'm just going to clean it up with some acetone, dissolve that paint, get it removed, so that when I do spray it with the coat that I actually wanted to finish with, it doesn't have any scratches underneath it that are going to show through. Acetone will dissolve superglue, so I can't just dunk it in a bottle of acetone. I have to paint it on with this brush. Since I applied the superglue from the back, it's mostly protected from the acetone and won't be dissolved much in this process. That's why this will work. So this is safe to do at this point. But as I said previously, it would have been better to remove the paint before I glued it together, just to get a stronger bond. Now the shield can be glued to the gun mounting. There isn't a clear location where it must be stuck. On the plastic part there's a little notch cut out, but unfortunately these Photo-etch pieces don't have that notch. So it's more of a case of estimating where you think it should go and then trying to position it so that when you look at it from all the various angles, it looks aligned correctly. That is a little bit more difficult than it sounds. Once I had it in a good position, I then used Accelerator to instantly set the superglue and hold it where I want it. It is a bit difficult to see, but in some locations the roof of the shield has pulled away a bit from the sides of the shield, and that then required me to come back a bit later and touch that up yet again. It's just all contributing to these parts not being very nice to work with. They're small, curved, and not so easy to join together in an effective way. So with these 120mm guns, if their primary purpose genuinely was just to fire illumination rounds, did it have a secondary purpose? Did they keep any other ammunition for them? Did they try and use them as a tertiary battery, or even consider them for that use, to bolster the already sufficient secondary battery that these ships had? It seems to me to be quite a desperate thing to do, and that's what I don't understand. Is the weight of all this machinery worth the ability to independently fire illumination shells? Is that benefit so much greater than removing these guns and putting in extra 37 or 20mm anti-aircraft guns? Because presumably that's what they could have done if they didn't have these 120mm guns on the ship. Anyways, it's very strange to me, but I suppose it adds to the character of the ship. After much handling and back and forth, these parts were all glued together to my satisfaction, and then I moved on to the painting. This is an easy part to paint, fortunately. It all goes in this light grey camouflage colour. This is a paint that I had pre-mixed to the specification in the manual, and I made a whole lot of it just so that I could make it through the full build without having to mix up another batch of this colour, just to ensure colour consistency. I have quite a lot of it left over, so at this point I'm not at all worried about running out of it. It's really only these guns, then the anti-aircraft guns, and the launchers, and then that's all that I will need to paint in this colour. On 2 of the parts I cut off the base a little bit too close to the part, and there wasn't sufficient plastic for me to grip with the crocodile clips, so I'll just have to paint these in 2 passes, holding it by the barrel, and then once the gun's dried, hold it by the gun and paint the barrel. Not such a train smash, but a little bit frustrating. Putting the paint on does liven up these parts quite a lot. I find that if you've done the glue properly, once you put the paint on, they start looking a lot better. Of course, if it isn't glued correctly, then you put the paint on and they look worse. But overall, the effect of this Photo-etch shield, even if it has been quite tricky to work with, is still considerably better than the plastic part, and therefore well worth the trouble. After letting the light grey paint dry for a while, I then sprayed it in a gloss varnish. This is Tamiya X22. I spray it in this varnish to protect the paint. It will make it a little bit more difficult to scratch off, and also to prepare it for panel line, which is part of the weathering process. The gloss coat helps the panel liner flow a bit more easily and also makes it a little bit easier to remove it, which is important if you, like me, prefer a lightly weathered effect. I want the ship to look freshly painted and relatively new, not some dilapidated derelict that's limping home after a savage battle. Since the underlying paint in this case is acrylic, if I do miss some parts, it's not the end of the world. The panel line is a oil-based paint and will be removed with turpentine, which won't harm acrylic paint. So I don't have to worry about accidentally removing it when I'm removing the panel line. And super glue is also going to be resistant against turpentine, so I don't need to worry about that either. The part will stay together. Of course, plastic is also not going to be harmed by turpentine. I do like to let the gloss coat dry for about a day before putting on the panel line, just to make sure it's properly cured and hard. Once that's dried, I then apply the panel line. Panel line can be applied liberally. You can remove it very easily, especially if you've covered it with a gloss coat. Just put it on wherever you want it and remove it later with turpentine. The gloss coat will protect the underlying paint and help panel line flow. Although in parts like this that are so small with such fine detail, it's really difficult to get panel line to flow over any detail. That's why I'm kind of just flooding the entire part with it, resigned to the fact that I won't be able to get that effect where you touch the edge of a line and it draws the panel line down a groove. These parts are a bit too small and finely detailed for that to work. Nevertheless, I still applied the gloss coat. It will still have the effect of protecting the underlying paint from scratches, because it does have that hard finish that normal paint does not have. After letting the panel line dry for around 10 minutes, I then came back with the mineral turpentine on a paintbrush and cleaned off the majority of it. Even if you remove the majority of the panel line, it will still assist with revealing the details and help create a more realistic looking part. Since the underlying paint is acrylic in this case, that paint will also not be removed by mineral turpentine, so this process is safe from that regard. If you do remove too much panel line, just come back and add more on. This is really something that gets done to your personal preference. In this model, I'm applying panel line and weathering as I go along. I've come to realize that that is a mistake. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because I hadn't tried it before, and then when I was looking at this model, I did see that there was quite a lot of complex superstructure with multiple levels and layers in front of each other, and I thought it'd be difficult to get the panel line in there and the gloss coat in there to do this all in one go at the very end like I usually do it. So for this model, I think there is some validity for weathering this kit in parts, but overall it's created a whole lot of additional work. This step would normally not be done at the end of every single piece. It would only be done at the very end once everything had been stuck down. So certainly for the next ship that I build, which is going to have a much less complex superstructure, I won't apply a panel liner as I go along. I'll basically build the ship and then at the very end apply a gloss coat to the entire ship in one go, and then do weathering across the whole ship and then cover it all in a matte coat instead of doing it piecemeal like this. It's not that it doesn't work. I think the effect is good, and in the sense that you are getting the panel line into every nook and cranny and also getting that matte coat into every nook and cranny probably makes for better coverage of the weathering effect. But realistically, the better coverage is coming in places that you can't see. So, what's the point? It doesn't matter if a bit of the kit that you can't see isn't weathered. I mean, yeah, I'm literally weathering all around the gun, inside the turret. The angle that you'd have to get to look into this thing to see everything would be quite difficult to achieve, especially for the way I display these models, sitting in a display cabinet. I don't let people lean over these ships. I find that that is just a recipe for somebody to stick out an arm and knock something off that they didn't see. I mean, I've done that enough times myself, and I've built things. One of the rules that I follow when doing rigging and essentially working over the ship, when I install the anti-aircraft guns, I'll also do this. I make sure that I'm wearing short sleeves, simply because the sleeve, you can't feel what's touching your sleeve very easily. So it's too easy to get hooked on a mast or something and then snap it off. Whereas if you aren't wearing sleeves, you can feel if you accidentally brush up against something and freeze and stop moving, and hopefully detangle yourself without damaging the ship. So going back to the 120mm guns and their purpose. So I was also thinking, well, would they use them for anything else? And I don't really have an answer to that, because they're not anti-aircraft guns. And as a tertiary battery, they probably wouldn't be very good at all. They are a smaller caliber with a short barrel, so they're probably not going to be all that good for fighting other ships. And they are an older design of gun. Doesn't look like they have such advanced machinery associated with them, so I don't expect the rate of fire to be anything spectacular. And then you got to just wonder, why did the Italians, would the Italians have even considered them as part of the surface-to-surface weaponry? It is not like the Roma is underarmed on its secondary battery. If you look at the Littorio class's contemporaries and their secondary batteries, they're actually very similar. Looking at the number of 152 or 155mm guns on one side of a ship, you can compare that to the Richelieu, which is sitting with 6, the Bismarck class, which is sitting with also 6. King George V has lighter guns, but 8 of them. So it's comparable. So it's not like the Roma is underarmed and desperately needed more guns for its secondary battery. So it's not that. It's not that they're good anti-aircraft guns. So are they really there just to fire illumination rounds? It seems very wasteful. Surely it would have been better for them to remove them and put in some more, say, 40mm anti-air. Wouldn't that have been a more valuable thing to have? Wouldn't that have been a more valuable use of the weight of these guns? And then instead fire illumination shells out of the 90mm guns. Unless for some reason the Italians couldn't build 90mm illumination rounds. Or they had such a high demand to fire so many illumination rounds to be effective at night. I just find them very strange. After removing the panel liner to my satisfaction, it's all ready to be sealed in with some matte varnish. This is Mr. Color 182. This varnish is very good. It goes a very long way. It mats things down very quickly and creates a nice effect. You just need to be careful not to put on too much. If you put on too much, you will create a frosting effect that is not attractive at all. If that does happen, it is easy to resolve. Just load up Mr. Rapid Thinner directly into the airbrush on its own and spray over the frosted parts just to re-moisturize them, and that effect will go away. Just don't do it too much such that it causes droplets to form and run on the paint, because that will then obviously destroy your model. When spraying a matte coat, it will lighten the part. The gloss coat will make your paintwork look darker, and then the matte coat will make your paintwork look lighter. Mr. Color 182 is a lacquer paint. It dries fairly quickly. After letting these parts sit for a few hours, I then install them on the ship. Installation is simple. Simply place them in the little holes on the deck. To stick them down, I'm using a tiny bit of extra thick super glue. Extra thick super glue is a bit more slow drying, which gives you time to position the part. Kind of floats on a bubble of super glue for a few moments before it actually settles down and sticks. I do like all my guns nicely lined up, perhaps a bit OCD of me, so that's what I'm looking for. just making sure that the gun is positioned in line with the hole, and then to make sure that the barrel is horizontal to the railing, or at least slightly tilted upwards. I definitely don't want it to be pointing down towards the deck. That would bug me. I think that would look weird. I use a toothpick to apply the super glue, and I put the tip of the super glue into the hole where I want the gun mount to go, and then by pushing it in far enough, a little bit of the glue will scrape off on the sides of the hole and create a ring around the hole on the surface of the deck. And being careful not to apply too much glue. If too much glue is put down when you place the gun on the hole, it'll then squish out to the sides and make a horrible mess. This is not a very complex installation. The most difficult part of it is locating the hole for you to stick through that small stub that sticks out of the base of the gun. Once that slips into place, the gun should sit flat on the deck. I didn't show it, but I had test fitted all of these guns before I tried to glue them down. That's an important step. Just test fit a part before you glue it down, just to make sure that it's going to sit flat and not do anything weird. These guns, they should be balanced sufficiently such that they can stand up on their own in the correct orientation in the location where they are supposed to be glued down. And with that, we come to the end of the video. Next up, we move on to anti-aircraft guns. And that is going to be a bit of a challenge. They are fairly tedious. There are a lot of them. And they're also very small. So I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to film it because I don't have macro lenses. I'll do my best with that, but it might be quite difficult to see what I'm doing. I have had a look over the parts and they are quite small. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge for me to figure out. Anyways, thanks for watching. Cheers.